and Wolfram has a physics project. And so I'm curious if you had a chance to go through it and what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, my basic objection to his project is the same as what it was 21 years ago, when, one of the first things I ever wrote as a student was a review of his A New Kind of Science book. And, what I spent half of that review doing is just explaining why, his kind of model cannot account for the known phenomena of quantum mechanics, right? And this is not a fuzzy statement. Like, this is a thing that one can prove, right? So, what he wants basically is to, reduce everything in the universe to cellular automata, right? To some, a bunch of bits, maybe at the Planck scale or something like that are, undergoing some sort of simple computational rules, like that far along. Yeah, I think, that's great. That's like, the whole physics community would like that, right? They would like, especially a theory of quantum gravity that would explain why, what's called the Bekenstein-Hawking entropy is finite, right? Why are there only finitely many degrees of freedom in a black hole, right? Or apparently in any physical system, right? Like, what is it, when you get down to the Planck scale of 10 to the minus 33 centimeters or 10 to the minus 43 seconds, right? Something seems to break in our picture of a smooth, continuous space-time. Okay, and we can see that from thought experiments where, for example, if you tried to build a clock that was more reliable, that could measure time more finely than 10 to the minus 43 seconds at a time, then your clock would take so much energy that it would just collapse to a black hole instead.
Right.
So, okay, so there are these thought experiments that tell us that sort of something breaks at the Planck scale. But, can you actually explain that by giving a theory where space and time are discrete or sort of discrete at the Planck scale, right? That is I would say, a central part of the problem of quantum gravity. Right, but now Wolfram, wants to do something else. Okay, he wants to say, no, it's not that we have a quantum mechanics with a finite dimensional Hilbert space and with a discrete space and time. He wants to in some sense get rid of quantum mechanics, right, and have it be a classical cellular automata, right? And then the problem is, well, we have in a mountain of evidence that quantum mechanics is both true and unavoidable, right? And so, what does he do with that evidence, right? And and he kind of hand waves it away, right? This is the key problem, right? He in A New Kind of Science, he said, well, it's true that there are these experiments that you can do on entangled particles, that could be very far away, that lead to these phenomena like the violation of the Bell inequality, right? Which is, famously a thing that sort of you could not explain in a classical universe, right? And that's just a very crisp statement, right? Like, it doesn't matter what additional assumptions you make, as long as they're reasonable ones or sort of sane ones. You say, I'm, Alice and Bob, who are far away from each other. They measure their halves of this entangled pair, and the statistics of the outcomes could not have been explained by any theory where the particles just secretly agreed in advance on, whether to be spin up or spin down or whatever, right? It can only be explained by saying, well, until Alice and Bob made the measurements, it was an entangled superposition state, right? So this is one of the strongest arguments that yes, the world is really quantum mechanical, and we can't just replace it by something else, by certainly not by a local hidden variable theory. But then what Wolfram says, and this is in chapter 9 of A New Kind of Science, he just says, well, okay, this is no problem. Just imagine that sometimes there are long-range threads between the particles, right? So usually space is local, but when, two particles become entangled, then there's kind of like a thread that allows instantaneous communication between them, right? Problem solved. Right. This is like, the Wolfram method, right? You just, if you can imagine a way that the problem could be solved, then it's solved, right? And so what I spent a lot of my review doing is just explaining, no, sorry, it still doesn't work. It still doesn't give you a picture that's compatible with special relativity. Okay, and so what you can get is that it's not just a statement about non-locality. It's sort of a statement that the universe cannot have if the measurements that Alice and Bob are going to make on the entangled particles have not been pre-decided, or sort of were not known in advance, then the outcomes of the measurements on the particles also cannot have been pre-decided. Right? They cannot be explained by hidden variables that go back to the beginning of time. They must be sort of genuine new randomness, right? Or otherwise you get a violation of locality. Okay, so this is so that was kind of the argument, and like I said, I just made that in 2002. Buried in my review of Wolfram's book. Now that same conclusion, a few years later, became famous when John Conway and Simon Koshin said something very similar in 2006, and they called it the free will theorem, right? And the way that they phrased it was that, like, if humans have free will, then subatomic particles must also have free will. and then that of course that got all over the popular press, right? But I would never have used the term free will here, right? Because I would say we could equally well just talk about randomness. Right. And that, but it's sort of I might have called it the freshly generated randomness theorem. Okay. And
I see.
it sort of tells you that, no model like Wolfram's from a new kind of science can explain, even, existing experiments like the Bell inequality violation, let alone, all the, the experiments of the future. Wolfram never really accepted that. I think most of the community did. He did not, right? But if you look at like what he's done more recently with the Wolfram, I think he called it the Wolfram model of physics. Like what he basically does is he just says, okay, well, wherever we have a result that we can't explain classically, then we'll just graft on the relevant part of quantum mechanics. Right. And it's like, okay, we'll assume that we have a multi-way system, so it can, evolve into superposition. It can evolve multiple ways simultaneously, and that's kind of like quantum mechanics, right? And and also like we will, say, oh, we can derive general relativity, except the derivation will basically be we like crib from a general relativity textbook. We just find out what the Einstein's equations are, and we say, okay, well, whatever is the cellular automaton, it's something that satisfies those equations. Right. So it's like, it's not sort of playing by the rules of physics, right? Where you have to actually, mathematically derive these things, right, from some simple starting postulate. And then ideally, make a novel prediction, right? That's the gold standard. Right. But, so one thing that, when I talked to, Wolfram in person a couple of years ago, when he was in Austin. And one thing that I kept trying to get clarity from him about was, does he predict that scalable quantum computers can work or not? And he wouldn't. He would not give a clear prediction. Basically, that like this multi-way theory, it suggests that maybe quantum computers can't work, but if it turns out that they do work, then the theory can accommodate that also. Right. And so it's kind of, it's sort of parasitic on existing science. It's like, he basically says, just tell me the prediction from existing science, and then I'll find a way to graft it onto this picture.
If you enjoyed that clip, then the full podcast is out right now. You can click around here. Enjoy. Subscribe to Theories of Everything to get notified of upcoming podcasts, as there are new full-length podcasts every week on the topics of mathematics, physics, consciousness, free will, and AI.